nobody heard the scream at Ravenswood Manor, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Chapter 1. The House That Swallowed Sound. The autumn of 1934 arrived in Derbyshire with the quiet menace of a creditor who has waited long enough. The moors turned the colour of old rust, the hedgerows thickened with shadow, and the great stone house known as Ravenswood Manor settled deeper into its own reputation, that of a place which kept secrets the way old wood keeps water, silently, completely, and without any outward sign until the rot had gone quite through. Captain Arthur Hastings arrived on a Thursday afternoon, having accepted what he believed to be a straightforward invitation to a shooting weekend. The letter had come from Sir Edmund Voss, a man Hastings had known slightly during the war, a decorated artillery officer turned industrialist, who had, by all accounts, made a considerable fortune in the manufacture of precision instruments. The invitation had been warmly worded, the shooting reputed to be excellent, and Hastings, finding London rather grey and himself rather at loose ends, had accepted without a second thought. He had not expected Ravenswood Manor to be quite so large, nor quite so still. The house rose from its surrounding parkland like something geology had produced, rather than architecture. 4 stories of blackened limestone, narrow windows that seemed designed to observe rather than admit light. Twin towers anchored the eastern and western wings, and the central facade bore a crest above its arched entrance. A raven in flight, wings spread, clutching what appeared to be a key in its talons. Gravel drive was immaculate. The topiary along its edges had been cut into severe geometric shapes, cones and cubes, that struck Hastings as somehow disapproving. The butler who admitted him was a tall grey man named Fellows, possessed of the particular stillness that the best butlers cultivate over decades of professional invisibility. He took Hastings's coat and hat with the solemn ceremony of a man receiving sacred objects, and led him through a marble entrance hall where a suit of armour stood sentinel beside a grandfather clock, whose pendulum swung with metronomic authority. The other guests are assembled in the east drawing-room, Captain Hastings, Fellows announced, opening a panelled door and standing aside. Hastings entered to find 6 people arranged about a room of considerable elegance, deep Persian carpets, oil paintings in heavy gilt frames, a fire that burned with aristocratic restraint in an Adam fireplace. He catalogued them quickly, as his association with Poirot had taught him to do, though he privately acknowledged that his observations rarely led anywhere useful. Sir Edmund Voss stood nearest the fire, a broad, vigorous man of 60, silver hair swept back from a high forehead, and the kind of face that had once been handsome, and had resolved itself into something more formidable. His wife, Lady Constance Voss, sat in a wing-back chair with a piece of embroidery she was not looking at. A slim, pale woman, perhaps 15 years younger than her husband, with dark eyes that moved constantly and a mouth held in the careful compression of someone who has trained herself not to speak impulsively. To Hastings's left stood Dr. Neville Ashworth, a thin, precise man of 50, with small spectacles and ink-stained fingers, introduced as the family physician and an old friend of Sir Edmund's from their Cambridge days. Beside him, perched on the arm of a sofa with the comfortable ease of someone thoroughly at home, Miss Dorothea Voss, Sir Edmund's daughter by his first marriage, a handsome woman of 30, with her father's directness, and, Hastings suspected, rather more of his intelligence than he credited her with. The remaining 2 guests were introduced as Mr. Gerald Fairfax, a London solicitor of about 45, lean and watchful, with the professionally neutral expression of a man accustomed to hearing show on his face. And Mrs. Sylvia Drummond, widow of independent means and animated conversation, who greeted Hastings with the warmth of someone who has been among reserved company too long, finds any new arrival a relief. "Hastings!" Sir Edmund crossed the room with genuine pleasure, pumping his hand. "Capital that you've come. We're a small party this year. I've been rather selective. People one can trust to be good company and not repeat one's conversations over dinner tables in London." There was something in the way he said it, a slight emphasis on the word trust, that Hastings filed away without knowing quite why. Cocktails were served. Conversation moved through the familiar channels of a country house weekend, shooting prospects, the unreliability of the weather, political of affairs treated with the careful vagueness of people who do not all share the same politics. Hastings noticed several things without knowing he was noticing them. That Gerald Fairfax, for all his social fluency, kept his eyes on Sir Edmund with a quality of attention that was not quite admiration. That Dorothea Voss and her stepmother barely spoke, and when they did, it was with the exquisite courtesy of mutual dislike, perfectly managed. That Dr. Ashworth refilled his glass twice before dinner was announced, each time with the practised casualness of a man monitoring his own intake. Dinner itself was served in a dining room of baronial proportions, a table that could have seated 20 accommodating 7. The food was excellent. Fellows and a young footman named Thomas, served with the synchronized efficiency of long practice. Post. It was over the fish course that Sir Edmund made an announcement. "I should tell you all," he said, setting down his fork with deliberate care, "that I have recently made certain changes to my will. My solicitor Fairfax has advised me against discussing the specifics, and I shall respect that advice. However, I feel it only right that those who might have expectations should know that circumstances have altered." He paused and looked around the table with calm authority. "I trust this will prompt no unpleasantness. I mention it now, so that no one is surprised later." The silence that followed this announcement was one of those silences in which a great deal is said by everyone simultaneously without a word being spoken. Hastings looked at Fairfax, whose expression had not changed by so much as a flicker. He looked at Dorothea, who had gone quite still. At Lady Constance, who had resumed her conversation with Mrs. Drummond as though nothing had occurred. At Dr. Ashworth, who was studying his fish. After dinner, the party dispersed in ones and twos. Hastings stepped onto the terrace for a breath of night air before bed, and stood looking out over the darkened parkland. The house rose behind him, enormous and silent. Somewhere in the trees a raven called once and was quiet. He went to bed thinking that it was a very fine house, and that something about it made him uneasy, and that he could not identify what. He would know by morning. Chapter 2. Sound no one remembered. Hearing Hastings slept badly, a thing he attributed to the unfamiliar bed and the wind that had risen in the night to worry at the windows with irregular persistence. He lay in the darkness, listening to the house make its ancient sounds, the groan of timber, tick of pipes, the occasional creak of a floorboard that might have been the building settling, or might have been footsteps, possible to say. He rose at 7:30, dressed, and descended to breakfast. The breakfast room was a smaller, more comfortable apartment than the dining room. East-facing, with good morning light, a sideboard bearing an array of covered dishes, and a table at which Dr. Ashworth sat alone with a cup of black coffee and an expression of considerable preoccupation. He looked up when Hastings entered, and the preoccupation was replaced with professional composure, but not quite quickly enough. "Morning, Captain. Sleep well?" "Tolerably," Hastings said, lifting the covers on the sideboard. "Yourself?" The doctor's response was non-committal, in a way that suggested it had been designed to be non-committal. Hastings helped himself to kedgeree and sat down. They talked about the shooting briefly. Mrs. Drummond arrived at 20 to 8, full of the cheerful energy of someone constitutionally resistant to atmosphere, and the conversation broadened to include London gossip and the merits of various Derbyshire walking routes. Gerald Fairfax followed at 5 minutes to 8, silent and immaculate, and helped himself to a small quantity of toast. Dorothea Voss came in at 8 precisely, looked around the table and asked, "Has anyone seen father this morning?" No one had. "He is always down by 7:30, she said, more to herself than to the room. "Without exception." She paused. "Has Fellows?" "I will inquire," said Fairfax, standing with an efficiency that struck Hastings as suggesting he had been waiting for an occasion to act. He returned 3 minutes later with Fellows, whose professional composure had developed a visible crack. "Sir Edmund has not rung, miss," the butler reported to Dorothea, though he addressed his words to the room in the way that people do, when no one present seems quite the right person to tell. "His breakfast tray has not been taken up. As he left instructions last evening, he would come down himself. Bedroom door is locked from the inside." Dorothea stood up immediately. "Come along, then." They went up in a body, all 5 of them, Fellows, and the footman Thomas, who had been summoned from somewhere, though no one remembered summoning him. The corridor on the first floor was wide and carpeted in dark red, the sort of carpet that absorbed footsteps so thoroughly that each of them moved unnatural silence. Sir Edmund's room was at the far end of the east wing. The door was solid oak, and when Dorothea knocked and called, and received no answer, it was Thomas who put his shoulder to it at Fellowes's nod. And it was Thomas, consequently, who stumbled into the room first and came to an abrupt halt. Sir Edmund Voss lay on the floor between his bed and the window, face upward, wearing his dressing gown. His position was that of a man who had stood, taken several steps, and then fallen without being able to catch himself. His face bore an expression of considerable surprise. His right hand was extended toward the window, the fingers not quite curled, as though he had been reaching for something, the curtain, perhaps, or the latch, when the final moment arrived. He had been dead for some hours. Dr. Ashworth determined this quickly, and with the quiet efficiency of professional habit, kneeling beside the body and making his examination, while the others stood in a cluster near the doorway. The room had no smell except the faint smoke of the fire, which had burned down to cold ash in the grate. The window was latched. The door, as established, had been locked from the inside, the key still in the lock on this side. "Hot?" Hastings asked quietly, standing beside Ashworth. The doctor did not answer immediately. He was looking at Sir Edmund's lips, which had a faint bluish quality that might have been consistent with cardiac failure, and might have been consistent with other things. He then looked at the bedside table, on which stood a glass of water, half empty, and a small bottle of Sir Edmund's habitual sleeping draught. "Possibly," said Dr. Ashworth. He stood up, and his voice was perfectly level. "I shall need to examine him more thoroughly. We should telephone for the police immediately. No one should touch anything in this room." Lady Constance had arrived by this time, drawn by the commotion, still in her mourning robe. She stood in the doorway and looked at her husband's body, with an expression that Hastings found he could not read at all. Not because it was blank, but because it contained too many things simultaneously, like a word that has too many meanings. It was Fairfax who telephoned not only the local police at Bakewell, but, with a precision that struck Hastings as significant, a second number, which he dialed from memory, and spoke into very quietly. Hastings watched him. "Who was the second call?" he asked. Fairfax replaced the receiver. Fairfax turned and regarded him with the expression of a man accustomed to questions he prefers not to answer. "Friend," he said, "who has experience in these matters?" He offered nothing further. It was not until 2 hours later, when the Bakewell constabulary had arrived and begun their careful, methodical, ultimately insufficient investigation, that the motor car appeared at the end of the gravel drive, a neat, dark vehicle that crunched to a halt before the Manor's entrance with the air of having arrived precisely when it intended to. From it descended a small man in an immaculate dark overcoat, patent leather shoes that seemed wholly impractical for a country autumn, a remarkable moustache, and the expression of someone who has been interrupted in something agreeable, and is reserving judgment on whether the interruption is justified. Hercule Poirot looked up at Ravenswood Manor, with his head tilted very slightly to the left, and his green eyes moving with systematic care across the facade, as though he were reading a document he intended to remember. "Ah," he said, to no one in particular, "a house that keeps its own counsel. We shall see about that." Chapter 3. The Meticulous Stranger with the Extraordinary Moustaches. The introduction of Hercule Poirot into the company at Ravenswood Manor produced effects that he would, privately, have found entirely predictable. Inspector Graves of the Bakewell Constabulary, a solid, competent man of the kind produced reliably by English provincial police forces, received him with the cautious respect of someone who has been warned that a famous detective is coming and is not entirely certain how to feel about it. The guests received him with the varied reactions of people who have something to conceal and are now confronting someone with a reputation for finding things out. Poirot absorbed these reactions without appearing to absorb them. He moved through the entrance hall with small, precise steps, accepted a cup of tisane from a nonplussed fellows who had not previously been asked to produce one, and established himself in a chair in the library with the composed authority of a man who has no intention of being hurried. Hastings, who had descended to meet him with considerable relief, sat across from him and provided a rapid account of the previous evening and morning. Poirot listened without interrupting, which was unusual, and without taking notes, which was characteristic. His small hands were folded in his lap. His moustaches were, as ever, immaculate. "The locked door," Poirot said, when Hastings had finished. "Tell me precisely what you observed. Key in the lock on the inside. Door solid oak. No give in it before Thomas broke it open. Window latched from inside. Checked myself. The latch was engaged, and there's a 12-foot drop to stone paving below. No drainpipe near enough to use. Chimney large enough for a person. Victorian flue. I thought of that. Not a possibility. And the glass on the bedside table, the sleeping draught. Ashworth took it. He sent it to be analysed, he says. Poirot raised an eyebrow by precisely 1 millimetre, he says, and the inspector. He has accepted this arrangement? Ashworth was rather forceful about it. Said he was the family physician and had authority over medical evidence. Graves seemed uncertain. Certainty, said Poirot thoughtfully, is a very useful condition to create in an inspector. Now, the guests. He looked at Hastings with an expression of gentle inquiry. Your impressions? Not facts, your impressions. Hastings considered carefully, knowing that on these occasions his impressions, however imprecise, were what Poirot was actually requesting. Dorothea is frightened and angry simultaneously. Fairfax is controlled to a degree that strikes me as professional rather than natural. Lady Constance is, he paused, performing grief, I think, not feeling it, Mrs. Drummond is genuinely distressed, but seems more shocked than anything. I don't think she's hiding anything significant. And Ashworth, he frowned. Ashworth is managing something. I can't put my finger on it. You have done very well, mon ami, said Poirot, the sincerity he reserved for moments when Hastings surprised him. Now, you say Sir Edmund announced last evening that he had changed his will, that no one showed any visible reaction. That's right, no visible reaction, Poirot repeated slowly. It was frequently the most visible reaction of all. When people feel nothing, they show it. When people feel a great deal and suppress it, the suppression itself is apparent to the careful observer. He stood up abruptly, smoothing his lapels. I will begin with the house, before the people. The house first, always. What followed was characteristic Poirot. A systematic examination of Ravenswood Manor that the inspector watched with poorly concealed impatience, and Hastings with attentive curiosity. Poirot moved through Sir Edmund's bedroom with the focused attention of a man reading a room as a text, touching nothing, bending occasionally to observe at close quarters, spending an unexplained 3 minutes at the window, and another 2 examining cold fireplace. In the corridor outside, he paused at a point approximately 15 feet from the bedroom door and crouched down, stiffly, dignity, to examine the carpet. What do you see, Hastings? Hastings looked at the carpet. Nothing. A perfectly ordinary carpet. Described to me the pattern. Dark red with a vine motif, repeated throughout the corridor. Yes. And here, a point in the pattern. You observe that the pile is slightly compressed, here and here, though something has stood on this precise spot for some time. Not a person. The impression is too regular, too flat. Hastings looked more carefully. A piece of furniture, or something that was placed here and then removed. Poirot straightened. We will continue. He examined the East Tower staircase, which was accessible from a door at the end of the corridor. A narrow stone affair, spiral, lit by a single high window leading to a locked room at the tower's top. The lock, Poirot observed, was new. The hinges, however, were ancient and had not been recently oiled. A point of some interest, he said, though he did not say why. By the time Poirot presented himself in the drawing-room to meet the assembled guests, Inspector Graves had developed the specific expression of a man who suspects he is being outmanoeuvred, but cannot determine the mechanism. The guests, summoned by Fellows, arrange themselves with the unconscious self-selection of people who feel the need for allies. Lady Constance and Mrs. Drummond together on the sofa, Dorothea alone by the window, Fairfax and Ashworth at opposite ends of the room, in a way that somehow did not read as a proximity. Poirot stood before the fireplace, a position Hastings recognised as deliberate, placing him where he could observe every face, and introduced himself with the courtly formality he brought to such occasions like a ceremonial weapon. I am Hercule Poirot. I have been asked by a friend, he did not specify who, and no one asked, to look into the unhappy death of Sir Edmund Voss. I am not the police, ladies and gentlemen. I cannot compel you to speak to me. But I have found in a long career that those who choose not to speak to me regret it rather more than those who do. He let this observation settle. I shall speak with each of you separately. I ask only that you tell me the truth, not because truth is always comfortable, because I shall discover it regardless. And it is considerably less troubling to discover it with one's cooperation than without. He smiled pleasantly. It was the smile, Hastings thought, of a man who means every word. Chapter 4. Questions that arrived. Like Scalpel's Poirot conducted his interviews in the library, Hastings seated unobtrusively to one side. Ostensibly to take notes, actually, Hastings suspected, to serve as a kind of social lubricant, presence reducing the formal pressure of Poirot's attention. He began with Lady Constance. She was, in person, formidable than her morning fragility had suggested. She had dressed for the occasion with evident care, a dark grey suit of impeccable cut, hair arranged with precise elegance, a single strand of pearls. She sat opposite Poirot, with her hands in her lap and an expression of composed sorrow that she wore with the confidence of a woman who knows how grief is supposed to appear. Poirot began, to Hastings's surprise, not with the night of the death, but with the dinner. "Your husband's announcement, Lady Constance." You were not surprised. It was not a question. She recognised this. "Edmund told me he was considering changes," she said. "He had not told me what. When did he tell you he was considering them?" Pause was very brief. "Several weeks ago." "And were you not curious? You did not ask him the nature of these changes?" "I have learned," Fondant, Lady Constance said, with a precision that suggested this was both truth and something more than truth, "not to involve myself in Edmund's financial arrangements. He considered these matters his sole province." "A philosophy, I understand." Poirot nodded. "Tell me of your marriage, if you please." Briefly. She did so. Briefly, married 9 years, a second marriage for both of them, first husband having died of influenza in 1921. She had met Sir Edmund through mutual friends. The marriage had been, she said, considerable mutual respect. "And the daughter, Dorothea? We are civil." "Civil," Poirot repeated, with the air of a man selecting the word for examination. "Civil. No more than that? Dorothea is her father's daughter. She has always considered herself the natural inheritor, shall we say, of his confidence and his estate. Presence in that role was not welcomed." "By natural inheritor you mean the will as it stood before these recent changes?" Silence this time was precisely calibrated. Lady Constance looked at him steadily. "I don't know what the will says, Monsieur Poirot. Told you that." "Quite so," said Poirot pleasantly. "One final question for now. You slept last night. You heard nothing? Sound from your husband's room? Nothing. My room is in the west wing. The distance is considerable. And you are a sound sleeper. Take a preparation. Dr. Ashworth prescribes it." Poirot's expression did not change by so much as a breath. "Ah, the same preparation your husband took. I believe so. Ashworth prescribes it for several of us." When she had gone, Poirot sat for a moment in silence. Then he said quietly to Hastings, "Several members of the household take the same sleeping draught prescribed by the same physician. Interesting. Note it." Hastings noted it and thought about it. Dorothea Voss arrived next, with the directness of someone who has decided honesty is the most strategic available option. She sat down, did not arrange herself for effect, and said, "I think he was murdered. I want you to find out who did it, and I do not want you to protect anyone when you do." Poirot regarded her with genuine respect. "Tell me why you think murder." "Because father was in excellent health. Ashworth said so himself at his last examination 6 weeks ago, because father never forgot to lock his door. It was a lifelong habit since a burglary in his first house in 1908. He told me the story many times, and because—" She paused, and something crossed her face that was more complicated than certainty. "Because he told me, 2 days ago on the telephone, that he was afraid." Hastings sat up. "He used that word?" Poirot asked softly. "He said, 'Dorothea, if anything should happen to me before next week, go directly to Fairfax and ask him for the sealed letter.' I asked him what letter. He said, 'You'll know when you need it.' And then he changed the subject entirely. And did you tell the inspector this?" "Not yet. I am telling you first." She met Poirot's eyes. "Told you are more reliable." Gerald Fairfax was the interview Hastings anticipated most. The solicitor arrived, took his seat, and produced immediately a sealed envelope from his inside breast pocket, which he placed on the desk between himself and Poirot. "Sir Edmund gave me this 3 weeks ago. He said it was to be opened in the event of his unnatural death. I have not opened it. I am giving it to you rather than the inspector, because my client's wishes were explicit. He specified a private investigator of quality, which he apparently anticipated would be you." Fairfax permitted himself the smallest possible smile. "He had a great admiration for your work, M. Poirot. We were perhaps acquainted?" "He knew of you. He read the newspaper accounts with interest." Fairfax folded his hands. "I should also tell you that the will, as changed 3 weeks ago, leaves the bulk of the estate, the manor, the investments, the industrial holdings, to Dorothea Voss. Lady Constance receives a generous life annuity, but no capital assets, Doctor. Ashworth receives a legacy of £5,000. Mrs. Drummond, as a personal friend, receives a small bequest. And yourself? Firm receives a continuation of its professional mandate. Nothing personal. A pause. And one other matter. Sir Edmund changed one specific bequest that had previously stood for many years. The East Tower and its contents, which had been designated for the Voss Family Trust, were personally and specifically left to Dorothea. He added a handwritten note to that effect. He was most insistent." Poirot looked at the sealed envelope. He did not open it. He placed it carefully in his own breast pocket and thanked Fairfax with precise courtesy. Alone again with Hastings, he sat quite still for 60 seconds, a habit Hastings had learned to respect, and then said, "The East Tower, Hastings. We shall need that key. Chapter 5. The Gardener's Inconvenient Memory." The interviews with Dr. Ashworth and Mrs. Drummond were, on the surface, less dramatic than those that had preceded them, which was precisely why Poirot conducted them with even greater attention. Mrs. Drummond was, Hastings had assessed, fundamentally honest, a woman of warm impulse and genuine feeling, who had been friends with Sir Edmund since they were neighbours in Yorkshire 30 years ago, who had been invited to Ravenswood annually, and who had no financial stake in his death. She wept, with the uncomplicated sincerity of real grief, and could tell Poirot nothing that seemed significant, except one thing, which she offered almost in passing. "I heard something last night," she said, pressing a handkerchief to her eyes. "Around midnight, I should think. Sound from below, from the direction of the study or the corridor near it. A sort of dragging sound. I'm a light sleeper, I'm afraid, quite the opposite of Constance. I didn't take Neville's preparation. I never do. Sleeping draughts give me such dreadful dreams. I thought at first it was the house. Old houses make such peculiar noises. But it went on rather long for a settling sound, perhaps 2 or 3 minutes of it. You did not go to investigate?" "I confess I did not. I told myself it was Fellows or Thomas. Then, I'm ashamed to say, I went back to sleep." "There is no shame in it," Poirot assured her. "You heard nothing else? No voices? Footsteps on the stairs?" "I thought, and I may have been dreaming, I thought I heard a door." "In the east wing direction." She looked uncertain. "But I truly cannot say with confidence." Dr. Ashworth presented a more complex surface. He was cooperative, precise, and, Hastings observed with interest, just slightly too cooperative, as though he had rehearsed cooperation as a strategy. He sat with his hands flat on his knees, his spectacles removed and polished twice in the course of the interview, and answered every question with the clipped accuracy of a professional witness. "The sleeping draught is a preparation of my own specification," he said. "Coral hydrate in a low therapeutic dose, in a pleasant tasting base. Sir Edmund had taken it for approximately 4 years, prescribed it for Lady Constance and for myself as well. I am a poor sleeper. And the bottle on the bedside table? I have sent it for analysis as a precautionary measure. I expect the results to confirm nothing more remarkable than the prescribed formulation. Sent it, Poirot said. Not the police. I took the initiative. I am the family physician. The chain of evidence. The chain of evidence is rather broken when the physician handles the evidence personally, Poirot observed, the mildness of a man making an uncontroversial observation. But we will leave that point. When did you last examine Sir Edmund professionally? 6 weeks ago, as part of an annual review. He was in good health for his age, heart entirely sound. I was specific on that point because he had a family history of cardiac trouble and was always anxious about it. Ashworth met Poirot's gaze with level steadiness. He did not die of his heart, Monsieur Poirot. I am confident of that. You are confident of what killed him? A pause, barely perceptible. I am confident of what did not kill him. The cause of death will be determined by proper post-mortem. Quite so, said Poirot. It was after these interviews that Poirot did something neither Hastings nor Inspector Graves had anticipated. He asked Fellows with great courtesy for an introduction to the garden staff, specifically to the under-gardener who lived in the cottage at the north edge of the parkland. This individual, whose name was Purvis, was a man of 70 of the breed that English villages reliably produce, weathered, monosyllabic, possessed of the deep ecological knowledge of a man who has spent his life attending to a single piece of ground, constitutionally honest in the way of people who have never been rewarded for dishonesty, and have consequently never bothered with it. Poirot interviewed him in the kitchen garden, standing among winter-bare rose canes, with the wind cutting across the open ground in a way that made Hastings's ears ache. Poirot appeared not to feel it. You were up early this morning, Poirot said to Purvis. It was not a question. He had, Hastings realised, already verified this through Fellows. 4:30, Purvis confirmed. Always. And you observed the manor. From the kitchen garden the east wing is visible. East tower right enough. You observed something? Purvis squinted at Poirot for a long moment, the squint of a man determining whether the question deserves an honest answer. Then, light in the tower room. At 5:05 I noted it particular because it's never lit. Not in the 30 year I've been here. Has a smell about it, that room, like old paper and lamp oil. Sir Edmund went up once a year to check on it, he said. Never anyone else. The light you saw, was it the overhead electric light? Or something else? Something moving, like a torch. And how long? 10 minutes or thereabouts. Then gone. Poirot thanked him with genuine warmth, the warmth he reserved for people who tell him true things, without requiring persuasion. On the walk back to the house, Hastings pulled his coat tighter against the wind and said, Someone was in the tower at 5 in the morning. Yes, said Poirot. But Sir Edmund was already dead. Yes, said Poirot. So whoever was in the tower was not Sir Edmund. Poirot walked on, small and precise, his breath visible in the cold air. They were looking for something. The question, Hastings, is whether they found it. Chapter 6. What the portrait chose to conceal. The key to the East Tower room was found in Sir Edmund's desk, or rather, was not found there, which was itself significant. The desk had a shallow centre drawer that bore a small label in Sir Edmund's hand. East Tower, and the drawer was empty. Inspector Graves noted this, with the frustration of a man who has arrived at a locked room to find it already unlocked and its contents removed. Pois. Poirot noted it with the expression of someone whose hypothesis has been confirmed. They entered the tower room ultimately by means of a duplicate key. Discovered after considerable searching by Fellows, tin box in the butler's pantry, a spare key of great age, its tag so faded as to be barely legible. The door opened on a room. that had indeed not been thoroughly used in many years. It was circular, the tower dictated, perhaps 15 feet in diameter, with stone walls bare of plaster and a wooden floor of ancient boards. A single window, small and diamond-paned, admitted the grey morning light. The room contained 2 metal deed boxes, both with intact locks, a wooden chest that proved to contain papers of the 1890s relating to the original purchase of the estate, and on the wall opposite the window was a dust sheet that had recently been disturbed. Its edges displaced, the dust pattern interrupted. A portrait. Poirot removed the dust sheet himself carefully and stood before the portrait for some time. It was a painting of a man, perhaps 50 in the portrait, dark-haired, with a long, intelligent face and eyes of a particular shade of amber that the painter had achieved through some skill with glazing. The man wore the dress of the early century and held in his right hand a document that the painter had rendered in detail to be legible as a letter or legal paper of some kind. The portrait was unsigned, which was unusual, and it was framed in plain wood without ornament, which was unusual for a portrait of this quality and evident expense. At the portrait's lower edge, someone had attached a small brass plate, and on the plate was engraved not a name but a date. October 14th, 1903. "Do you know this person, Poirot?" asked Dorothea, who had accompanied them. She looked at it for a long moment. Something happened in her face that she did not quite control. "I have never seen this portrait before," she said, "and I have been in this house since childhood." "But you recognize the face?" Another pause. "He looks," she said slowly, "rather like father, around the eyes. But I don't know who he is." Poirot looked at the portrait for another full minute. Then he moved to the deed boxes. Both were locked, and neither lock corresponded to any key on Sir Edmund's ring or in the butler's pantry tin. Both boxes, however, lighter than they should have been, a fact Poirot established by attempting to lift one with a single hand, which he did with ease. "Empty," said Hastings, "or nearly, recently emptied." He indicated the carpet before the boxes, which the pattern of dust was interrupted in a way consistent with the boxes having been moved, opened, and their contents removed. Torchbearer of 5 in the morning had been thorough, but not quite thorough enough. In the corner of the room, against the wall behind the door, a corner that would be in shadow when a torch was aimed at the central objects, Poirot found a single piece of paper. It had slipped perhaps from a bundle being hastily gathered, and fallen in the angle between wall and floor where the torch beam had not reached. He picked it up with his handkerchief, a lawyer's caution about fingerprints having apparently communicated itself to him at some point in his career. He read it without expression. He folded it with the handkerchief and placed both in his breast pocket, alongside the sealed envelope from Fairfax. He told no one what it said. The descent from the tower was made in silence. At the bottom, in the narrow corridor outside the tower door, Poirot paused and looked at the floor. The stone floor here, not carpet, and then at the adjacent wall, where an ornamental bracket held an electric lamp. The bracket was positioned at approximately shoulder height, and on the bracket, barely visible unless one was specifically looking, was a small, dark smear. Poirot looked at it for a long time. "Hastings," he said quietly, "do you carry a magnifying glass?" Hastings produced, somewhat triumphantly, a small folding glass he had taken to. Carrying after the first several years of these adventures had taught him its utility. Poirot examined the smear closely. "A fingerprint," he said, more to himself than to Hastings. "Half a fingerprint, to be precise, the outer edge, made by someone who steadied themselves against this bracket in darkness. Someone who is left-handed, I think, from the angle." He straightened and looked thoughtful. 3 of our 5 suspects, one recalls, are left-handed. I noted it at dinner. It is always worth noting. He did not say which 3. On the way back through the East Wing corridor, he stopped once more at the point where the carpet showed the compression he had noticed in the morning. He crouched again, more briefly, this time removed from the compressed area a single short fibre, grey and of a weave that was neither carpet nor clothing fabric. "Rope," said Hastings, looking at it. "Rope," confirmed Poirot. "Or something woven. Something that was suspended or pulled. Or—" he held the fibre up to the light from the corridor window. "We shall see." That evening, Poirot requested access to the dining room, and the drawing room, and spent an hour examining each with the same quiet systematic method. In the dining room he paid particular attention to the window-sill, which was lower than in most rooms, a detail of the Manor's original Elizabethan core that had been retained through various renovations. He measured something with a small tape measure. He made a note in his notebook. In the drawing room, he spent a long time looking at the oil paintings on the wall. Not the paintings themselves, but their arrangement, all between them. One section of wall, Hastings realised, sounded different when Poirot pressed it with one knuckle. Not hollow exactly, but not entirely solid. Poirot smiled at the wall with satisfaction, as though it had confirmed something he had long suspected. "The house," he said softly, "keeps its own counsel, but I have asked it the right questions." Chapter 7. The Weight of Old Debs and Older Sins. The evening brought an unexpected development, a confession. Not the confession Hastings was anticipating, not to Poirot, but to Hastings himself, which was, in retrospect, characteristic of the category of confession it was. He had gone to the billiard room after dinner. Dinner being a subdued and uncomfortable affair, at which Lady Constance had been conspicuously composed, Dorothea conspicuously vigilant, Fairfax and Ashworth occupying opposite ends of the table in the manner of 2 chessmen whose positions on the board were significant to people who understood the game, and found Dr. Ashworth there, not playing billiards but standing at the window with a glass of brandy in his hand, and the look of a man who has made a decision and is bracing himself against it. He turned when Hastings entered and said, without preamble, "Sit down, Hastings. I need to tell someone before I tell Poirot. You seem the appropriate intermediate." Hastings sat down. The story, Ashworth told, occupied the better part of 40 minutes, and required 2 glasses of brandy for its teller and 1 for its auditor. It was at its core a story of debt, professional and personal and moral, all intertwined in the way that genuine human catastrophe tends to intertwine its elements, so that the beginning can no longer be clearly distinguished from the middle. Ashworth had, he said, borrowed money from Sir Edmund Voss 12 years ago. Not a trivial sum, £4,000, which at the time represented more than his annual income. The loan had been made without formal documentation, as a matter of personal friendship, and on one condition, that Ashworth would, in his capacity as Sir Edmund's physician, provide certain services. "What services?" Hastings asked. He was developing a suspicion. "Information," Ashworth said, looking at his brandy rather than at Hastings. Medical information about certain individuals, provided to Sir Edmund in confidence. Information that was useful to him in his business dealings. Not falsified information. I want that clear. True information, obtained in my professional capacity, about the health of individuals whose incapacity might affect share prices, contracts, business negotiations. Hastings sat quietly for a moment with this. He was using you to get advance intelligence about people's health. He was a businessman, Ashworth said, which was not a contradiction of what Hastings had said. I was a fool, and I was desperate, and I allowed it to begin. Once begun, it could not be stopped, because the initial judgment itself was enough to destroy me, professionally, if he chose to reveal it. But the debt, was it ever repaid? Never. It was never meant to be repaid. That was the mechanism of control. The debt existed as a permanent instrument, a chain. Ashworth's voice was very quiet. 3 weeks ago, when he changed his will, there was a conversation. He told me that the legacy to me in the new will was contingent on my continued cooperation, with new requests. He looked up at last. Requests I was no longer willing to fulfill. What did you say? I told him I was done, that he could do his worst. He paused. He was not frightened. He was quite calm. He said he had other means of ensuring cooperation, and that I should think very carefully. Hastings asked the necessary question with some delicacy. Did you go to his room that night? No. The word was simple and direct. I did not kill Edmund Voss, Hastings. I hated him, in the way that one hates a person who has degraded one over a long period, but I did not kill him. He paused. However, he said, I know who might have. He told Hastings a name, and the name, when Hastings brought it to Poirot in the library. Shortly after 11 that evening, Poirot sat very still indeed, for almost a full minute before he said anything. He is certain? Poirot asked at last. He says he saw. What he says he saw, and what he can prove he saw, are two different things. Poirot stood, and walked to the fireplace and stood looking into the fire. What he has told you is a thread, Hastings, a thread that connects to other threads, and together they may form a pattern. But first, he turned, piece of paper I found in the tower room. I will tell you what it said, he told Hastings. Hastings stared at him. Good Lord, yes. Now it makes a certain sense of the portrait. The man in the portrait, Hastings, the unsigned portrait with a date rather than a name, was not an ancestor of Sir Edmund Voss. He was Sir Edmund's father's partner in a business venture in 1903 that ended in that man's financial ruin, and shortly after, his death. A suicide. The document he holds in the portrait is, I believe, the agreement that Edmund Voss Sr. used to strip him of everything he owned. How could you know that from the paper? Because the paper is a letter, partial only, as I said, written in a woman's hand, apparently to Sir Edmund, clearly written recently, in the last years. And it says, you know what your father did to mine, and you know that I know. Tired of waiting for justice. If you will not give it voluntarily, I will take it. Hastings was silent. A woman's hand, Poirot said softly. The handwriting. Hastings, educated, controlled, but with a particular style I have seen once before today. He said nothing more, but in the morning Hastings looked, and he saw what Poirot meant. Chapter 8. What the embroidery concealed. The post-mortem report arrived the following morning by telephone. Inspector Graves receiving it with an expression that progressed from professional attention to visible concern to something approaching alarm. He requested a private conference with Poirot immediately after, which Poirot granted, and which Hastings was permitted to attend, on the grounds that Poirot acknowledged no operational distinction between himself and his companion. The cause of Sir Edmund's death was not cardiac failure. It was poisoning, specifically coral hydrate in a quantity approximately 4 times the therapeutic dose. The preparation was consistent with his prescribed sleeping draught, but concentrated. The quantity found in his system was incompatible with the bottle on the bedside table, which, analysis confirmed, contained the ordinary therapeutic preparation without abnormality. He was given a concentrated dose, Graves said, his voice carrying the tone of someone stating a fact they wish were otherwise. Not from his own bottle, through some other vehicle. The water glass, perhaps, or something he consumed earlier in the evening. The wine at dinner, Hastings suggested. Possibly. It was not in a form that would have been taste detectable in wine. Graves looked at Poirot. This is murder, premeditated and clever. Yes, said Poirot. Now, the locked door. The key was in the lock from the inside. We've established. You have established that the key was in the lock when Thomas opened the door. You have not established that it was there for the entire night. Poirot produced from his pocket, with the care of a man presenting evidence, a small metal hook. Ordinary, the kind sold in any hardware shop, attached to a length of thin wire approximately 3 feet long. This instrument, very simple, inspectature, nothing arcane. A key in a lock may be turned from outside through the keyhole, and then patience, drawn to the edge of the keyhole and dropped. If a piece of paper has been slipped under the door first, key may be drawn back under the door once it has fallen. The carpet in the corridor is thick, and the space under Sir Edmund's door, I measured, just adequate. Graves stared at the hook. You're saying the room wasn't locked from the inside. I am saying it was made to appear locked from the inside. The murderer locked it from the outside, after poisoning Sir Edmund and ensuring his death, and the gap under the door and a steady hand did the rest. The carpet impression, Hastings said. Small wooden platform was placed in the corridor. To kneel upon, perhaps, to hold steady while working with the hook. Hence the rope fibre, piece of ordinary sacking, something that could be folded and removed. Poirot stood. The murderer had prepared everything with great care. Several days of preparation, I think. The choice of poison, something already in the house, Matt, already prescribed, above suspicion, method of administration, hidden within an ordinary dinner, the means of securing the room afterward, all thought through. Graves absorbed this. Who? I am not yet ready to say with certainty, Poirot replied, but I will be. It was Lady Constance who asked to speak with Poirot that afternoon, a reversal of the usual arrangement that he accommodated without surprise. She came to the library, closed the door and sat down, and this time there was no performance of composed grief, which Hastings found oddly more affecting. I know what the will says, she said. Fairfax told me last year when Edmund first discussed changing it. I have known for 11 months that I am to receive only the annuity. And this distressed you. This enraged me, she said, with a directness that cut through every layer of social plasterwork. I have spent 9 years of my life making this house function. Managing it, managing Edmund's social obligations, managing his moods, which were considerable and were never reported in the newspapers, received in return. Comfort, yes. Position, yes. And now, a stipend, like a pensioned-off servant. Did you argue with Sir Edmund about this? Repeatedly. He was unmoved. And on the night of his death, something shifted in her face. Not guilt, Hastings thought. Something adjacent to it. I went to his room, she said, at about 11:30. I had taken my sleeping draught, but it had not yet acted, and I wanted to speak with him once more. The door was unlocked when I knocked. I went in. He was already asleep, or I thought he was asleep. He was in bed, breathing. I sat in the chair and looked at him and decided there was nothing useful to say. She paused. I left. I relocked his door. I used his key, which was on the bedside table, and when I left, I put it back through the keyhole. It was not difficult. Gap under the door is substantial. Her voice was entirely steady. He was alive when I left. I promise you that. Poirot looked at her for a long moment. You have been very honest, Lady Constance. I wonder why. Because, she said, someone else killed him, and I don't intend to be blamed for it. After she had gone, Hastings turned to Poirot with some agitation. She admitted entering the room. She admitted handling the key. She could have. But the timing, Hastings. She placed the poison at dinner, we believe. She went to the room at 11:30 to confirm its effect. He was alive at 11:30. This means either the poison had not yet acted, which is consistent with a dinner-time administration being slow release, or he paused. Poison was administered after Lady Constance's visit. By someone else entirely. The house settled around them. Grandfather clock in the hall marked the half-hour with its stately chime. 2 visitors, Poirot said quietly. One who came and found him alive, and one who came later and did not leave him so. Chapter 9. The Architecture of Lies. On the third morning at Ravenswood Manor, Poirot was observed by Hastings to do something unusual. He ate his breakfast with evident satisfaction. This was, in Hastings's experience, a sign not of relaxation but of resolution. The expression of a man whose grey cells have completed their most important work, and who is now engaged in the more mechanical process of confirming and arranging what he already knows. He read the sealed letter from Fairfax at the breakfast table, alone, before anyone else had descended. When Hastings arrived, the letter was resealed, or rather, facsimile had been produced with identical-looking wax, which spoke to either considerable advance preparation or resources. Hastings found it more comfortable not to inquire too closely about. The original letter was in Poirot's pocket. He spent the morning in separate, brief, intensely specific conversations with each of the principals, not the wide-ranging interviews of the previous days, but targeted exchanges, each lasting no more than 10 minutes, each focused on a single point. With Ashworth, he asked about the absorption rate of coral hydrate in wine versus water, and the approximate window between a dinner-time dose and its fatal effect, and whether a concentrated preparation would require specialist medical knowledge to produce, or could be achieved by a layman with access to a pharmacy. With Fairfax he asked whether Sir Edmund had ever mentioned a man named Hargreaves, and what the legal status was of a business agreement from 1903 that had resulted in one party's bankruptcy, and whether there were surviving heirs from that arrangement. With Dorothea, he asked when she had first become aware of the portrait in the East Tower, and whether she had ever heard the name Hargreaves from her father, and whether she had noticed any individual paying particular attention to the east wing of the house in the period before the weekend. Dorothea's answer to the last question was yes. With Mrs. Drummond, he confirmed the time of the dragging sound, and asked whether she had, on reflection, any impression of where in the house it had originated. She thought. Carefully. Below me and to the east. The study corridor, perhaps the passage to the tower stairs. With Lady Constance, he asked only one question. When you replaced the key through the keyhole of Sir Edmund's door, did you notice anything on the corridor floor? She thought, and then said, there was a dark object of some kind near the wall. I noticed it because one's eyes, in the dark, seek shapes. I assumed it was a piece of furniture. A low piece? A trunk or a box? Thank you, said Poirot. He assembled them all that afternoon. The drawing-room, with its Persian carpet and restrained fire, had the quality of a stage set during these final hours, each person placed as if by an invisible director. The late autumn light coming grey through the tall windows, the house silent around them. Inspector Graves stood by the door with the expression of a man who has been asked to witness something he does not entirely understand, but has been assured he will find it conclusive. Poirot stood before the fireplace as before, but this time he did not introduce himself or make preliminary remarks about cooperation. He began simply with the truth. Sir Edmund Voss was murdered. He was poisoned with a concentrated preparation of coral hydrate, introduced into his wine-glass at dinner. Poison acted slowly, as designed. He retired to bed, feeling only the effects of his ordinary sleeping preparation, died in the early hours without fully regaining consciousness. His room was then locked from the outside by a method simple enough to be overlooked and complex enough to suggest that the murderer had spent considerable time thinking about it. He paused and looked at each face in turn. I want to speak to you about a man named Albert Hargreaves. He was a businessman of the early century, a man of intelligence and invention, who, in 1903, entered into a partnership with Sir Edmund's father, Henry Voss. Henry Voss was a man who believed that the law was a tool to be used by those who understood it. That sentiment was an expensive luxury in business. He used the partnership agreement which he had drawn with careful asymmetry to strip Hargreaves of everything: his investment, his patents, his livelihood. Albert Hargreaves died in January 1904, what the coroner called misadventure, but his family called despair. The room was utterly silent. He left a daughter, 11 years old at the time. She grew up in poverty, educated herself through determination and borrowed money, and spent the better part of 3 decades building a life that would not have existed if Albert Hargreaves had not been destroyed. She also spent those 3 decades waiting and then planning, because she had the document, not the original, that disappeared into Henry Voss's files and subsequently into the east tower of this house, but a copy retained by her father's solicitor, which detailed precisely how the betrayal had been accomplished. Poirot reached into his breast pocket and removed the 2 papers, the fragment from the tower room and the letter from the sealed envelope, and held them up, one in each hand. Wrote to Sir Edmund 6 months ago. A letter that is now in the sealed envelope his solicitor held. She told him what she knew. She demanded restitution, not a fortune, not vengeance, but acknowledgement and fair compensation. Sir Edmund refused. He attempted to find out her identity and could not. He grew frightened enough to write to Mr. Fairfax about a private investigator, frightened enough to warn his daughter. He paused, frightened enough to bring to this weekend gathering every person he suspected might be connected to the matter. He looked at Mrs. Drummond. Mrs. Drummond sat very still, and the warmth went out of her face entirely. Not replaced by coldness, but by something more honest than warmth. She was, without it, more formidable figure. "Your maiden name," Poirot said gently, "was Hargreaves. Sylvia Hargreaves. You married Drummond in 1920 and took his name, and you subsequently moved 3 times and built a life in which this history was buried beneath your husband's identity, and then, after his death, beneath your widow's independence." He looked at her steadily. "You have known Sir Edmund for 30 years, you said." "Yes, because you placed yourself in his circle deliberately. You waited until you were trusted before you acted." "The sleeping draught," Ashworth said, very quietly from across the room. "She knew I prescribed it. She knew its properties because she asked me once. I remember now. She asked about it very casually at a dinner in London last spring. She said she was thinking of asking me to prescribe it for herself. She needed to know the concentration required for a lethal dose." Poirot confirmed. "She is an intelligent woman, and she had spent years preparing. The concentrated preparation was created in advance, brought to the manor in a small vial and introduced to Sir Edmund's wine glass at dinner, when the general movement of the table and the placing of dishes provided sufficient cover." He looked at Mrs. Drummond. Her face had achieved the stillness of someone who has decided that the truth, now that it is here, deserves to be met rather than avoided. "You were in the tower at 5 in the morning, Poirot said. You had the key. You had taken it, I believe, from the corridor carpet where Lady Constance dropped it on her way back to her room at 11:30. You collected the documents that detailed your father's ruin and removed them, except for the fragment. He held it up, portrait of your father, which you could not take and could not destroy without obvious evidence of interference, covered again, and hoped would not be noticed. He paused. The fingerprint on the bracket, left-handed. You are left-handed, Mrs. Drummond. She spoke at last. He was a murderer, she said. His father murdered mine, and he knew it, Plon, and he inherited the fruits of it, and used them, and was never troubled by it for 60 years. I asked him, in that letter, for nothing more than acknowledgment. He wrote back, one line, that he knew of no such arrangement and had nothing further to say. And so you killed him, and so I killed him. Her voice was entirely steady. I do not repent it, Monsieur Poirot. I am sorry to say it directly. But it is true. He had 30 years of everything that should have been my father's. I had 30 years of nothing that should have been mine. She looked at him with the clear eyes of someone whose internal accounting is completely settled. Do what you must. Chapter 10. All the King's Logic Inspector Graves arrested Mrs. Drummond in the drawing-room of Ravenswood Manor at 4:30 in the afternoon, with the formal courtesy of a man who finds the moment both necessary and melancholy. She went with him without protest, without demonstration, without the disintegration that guilt-laden arrests often produce. She went as a person who has completed something, not with the lightness of someone who has escaped, but with the particular solidity of someone whose account with the world is now, whatever the law's opinion, closed. Poirot watched from the doorway as the police car moved away down the gravel drive. The remaining guests dispersed to their rooms in the quiet, shaken way of people who have been present at something and are not yet certain how they feel about it. Only Dorothea remained, standing in the entrance hall beside the suit of armour and the grandfather clock, looking at the front door through which everything had just exited. Did you know it was her when you arrived? She asked Poirot. No, I suspected a grievance rooted in the past. The portrait, the unsigned date, the nature of the letter fragment, all pointed to a historical wrong rather than a contemporary one. I did not know how close to the manor's ordinary life the answer would be. She seemed so ordinary, so genuinely kind. The two things are not incompatible, Poirot said, with something that was neither agreement nor disagreement. She was kind, and she was also someone who had carried a profound injury for 30 years and finally acted on it. Human beings contain many things simultaneously. It is the mistake of the comfortable life to suppose otherwise. Dorothea looked at him for a moment. Do you think she was wrong? Poirot was quiet for a longer moment than usual. The law will determine that she committed murder, and it will be correct in that determination. Host. The other question, whether the injury that preceded the murder was itself a kind of crime, and whether 30 years of watching it go unaddressed was itself a kind of punishment. That question I leave to more philosophical minds than mine. He settled his hat on his head with characteristic precision. I think of the grey cells, mademoiselle. They tell me what was, and how, and who. They do not always tell me, in the end, whether what was done was understandable. He paused, and added very quietly, though sometimes they do. Hastings, on the morning of departure, asked Poirot as they waited for the motor car. When did you know it was her? Truly? Poirot considered this with the seriousness it deserved. There were 3 moments. First was when she told me she had heard the dragging sound at midnight, the sacking platform being moved, and placed herself as the only guest not taking Ashworth's sleeping preparation. She told me she was a light sleeper. In fact, she needed to be a light sleeper because she needed to act during the night, and the preparation would have impeded that, so she refused it. He held up a finger. Second, the warmth. She was, of everyone in this house, the warmest in personality. The most immediately sympathetic. I have found over many years that genuine warmth and practiced warmth are different things, but that a person of deep conviction can produce the latter so perfectly from habit that it becomes indistinguishable from the former. Except that genuine warmth fluctuates naturally, practiced warmth is sometimes too consistent. And the third? The embroidery. Poirot smiled. Lady Constance had embroidery that she was not working on. I observed later that the pattern she was supposedly working was a Florentine stitch requiring close attention. She is not an embroiderer. It is a social prop, Mrs. Drummond, however, who sat beside her and appeared to be merely socializing. Her fingers, when she thought herself unobserved, made the specific movement of someone counting threads. She had spent years doing handiwork of precision. It is the kind of trained patience, counting, measuring, weighting, that characterizes a person who plans on the scale she planned. He looked at the Manor's facade one last time with his tilted head assessment. A house that kept its counsel, he said, but not indefinitely. Chapter 11. The Raven delivers its verdict. The drive away from Ravenswood Manor was accomplished in the particular silence that follows complicated events. The silence of people sorting through what they have seen and heard, filing it properly, determining what they will say about it, and to whom. The Moors rolled past the car windows in their grey or autumn authority, indifferent to human justice and its imperfect instruments. Hastings, to some miles, said, "What happens to the estate now? As the will stands, Dorothea inherits. The will's validity is unaffected by the murder, since Dorothea is not the convicted party." Poirot looked out the window. She is a capable woman. The manor will be adequately managed, and the matter of the original Hargreaves claim, the injustice of 1903. That, said Poirot, is a matter for Fairfax, and for whatever action Dorothea chooses to take. For I told her what I told no one else. The contents of her father's sealed letter, which addressed precisely this matter. Sir Edmund, in that letter, acknowledged the Hargreaves affair privately, and, perhaps from a genuine late stirring of conscience, perhaps from simple practicality, set aside a sum in a separate arrangement, to be administered by Fairfax for the benefit of any surviving Hargreaves descendants. Hastings stared at him. He did? He was afraid, Hastings. Fear does sometimes what conscience alone cannot manage. Poirot's voice was perfectly neutral. The sum is not generous, does not restore 30 years of dispossession, but it exists. And Mrs. Drummond, does she know? She will be told. I saw to that. He paused. Whether she finds it adequate, I cannot say. She may. She may find that the act and the acknowledgment have arrived in the wrong order to offer consolation. He turned from the window. Tragedy is frequently a matter of timing. Trial of Sylvia Drummond occupied 3 days at the Derby Assizes and attracted considerable public attention. Such cases will, when they combine poison, a closed country house, and the additional element of historical injustice that the newspapers found irresistible. The defence argued diminished responsibility and the accumulated psychological weight of 30 years of loss. Prosecution argued premeditation of the most deliberate and considered kind. Both were correct. She was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, acknowledged the exceptional circumstances without allowing them to alter the verdict. A distinction that the newspapers found philosophically rich the public found variously satisfying and insufficient depending on their inclinations. Poirot, who had given his evidence with the precision of a man who will say exactly what is true, and nothing more than what is true, the courtroom without comment to the waiting journalists. Hastings, beside him, noted that his expression was the one he wore when a case was solved, and the solution was, in all its correctness, not entirely satisfying. "You might have concealed the evidence from the tower room," Hastings said, somewhat carefully. "I might have," Poirot said. "I did not." "No." They walked in silence for a moment. "The grey cells," Poirot said at last, "do not make moral judgments. They observe, they connect, they conclude. What is done with the conclusion is the province of the law and of conscience, and these are not the province of Hercule Poirot." He straightened his already straight hat. "I would not have the grey cells make exceptions, Hastings. The moment they begin to make exceptions, they become unreliable, and an unreliable instrument of reason is worse than no instrument at all." "And yet," Hastings said. "And yet," Poirot agreed, with a heaviness that was brief and genuine, and then characteristically mastered. Chapter 12. The Silence After Justice. 3 weeks after the trial, Hastings received a letter from Dorothea Voss, written on Ravenswood Manor notepaper in her father's characteristically direct style, informing him that she had retained Fairfax to investigate the Hargreaves matter fully, probust, that she had spoken with the prison governor's office about Mrs. Drummond's conditions of imprisonment, and that the portrait of Albert Hargreaves had been moved from the east tower to the east drawing-room, where it was hung in a proper frame with a proper nameplate. She did not ask for Poirot's opinion of these decisions. She offered them as information, and Hastings understood that this was correct. He read the letter aloud to Poirot, who was engaged with a crossword in his armchair at Whitehaven Mansions, and who listened without looking up. "Mademoiselle Dorothea," Poirot said, when he had heard it, "is an excellent woman. Rather more than her father, by the sound of it. Perhaps it is a common pattern. The generation that accumulates is not always the generation that deserves." He completed an answer in the crossword with a small sound of satisfaction. "She will make something worthwhile of that house. It has been too long a house of secrets." Hastings thought about this. "Do you think Mrs. Drummond, Sylvia Hargreaves, would have been satisfied if she had received, instead of a letter of refusal, what Dorothea is now proposing?" Poirot set down his crossword and thought about this genuinely, which was itself unusual. He generally reserved the genuinely difficult questions for silence rather than deliberation. "I think," he said at last, "that by the time she committed the act, satisfaction was no longer the object. She had lived 30 years with her father's portrait in her mind. The fact of it, the injustice of it, the daily texture of the life it had stolen from him. At a certain point, the injury becomes the identity, and one cannot simply hand such a person the remedy and expect it to undo the building." He looked at his hands. She needed the act to be completed. The justice she sought had become inseparable, in her psychology, from the punishment she intended. Remove one, and the other would have felt insufficient. "A tragedy, then," Hastings said. "All murder is a tragedy," Poirot said, "even when it is also comprehensible." He picked up his crossword. Outside the windows of Whitehaven Mansions, London went about its business with the cheerful indifference of a city that contains every human story simultaneously, and is surprised by none of them. Hastings poured them each a cup of tea and sat in his own chair and thought, as he always thought after these cases, that he ought to write it all down before the details escaped him. The raven crest above the door, the portrait of a ruined man, the dragging sound in the night that nobody heard as a murder, and everyone heard as a settling house. He got out his notebook. Chapter 13. What? The grey cells remembered Poirot alone in his apartment that same evening, Hastings having departed with his notebook and the earnest intention to write everything down that Poirot privately doubted would be fully realised. Sat for a long time in his armchair without his crossword, his tisane, or any of the small rituals of comfort and order that structured his hours. He was thinking about Albert Hargreaves. He thought about him not as a figure in a case, but as a person who had existed, who had had a daughter of 11 who saw him ruined and did not have the resources to understand it, and who had spent the subsequent 30 years becoming a person who understood it very thoroughly. He thought about the portrait, Sons, signed, hidden under a dust sheet in a room no one entered. The peculiar act of a man who cannot quite bring himself to destroy the evidence of what he knows was wrong, but cannot bring himself to display it either. Henry Voss had put the portrait in the tower. Edmund Voss had maintained the tower's lock and visited it once a year. What did a man think, Poirot wondered, when he sat alone with the portrait of someone his father had destroyed? Did he feel guilt? Did he rationalise? Did he, after 60 years, feel simply the numbing accommodation that the conscience makes with facts it has lived alongside for too long? He did not know. And this. The not knowing of what passes in the particular interior of a particular person was the part of his work that he had never, in a long career, resolved himself to with complete equanimity. The grey cells told him what was done. They told him how and who and when. But the private texture of the human experience that produced these events, the 30 years inside Sylvia Drummond's particular silence, the 60 years inside Edmund Voss's particular accommodation, that remained, as it always remained, some distance from even the finest instrument of reason. This was, Poirot had concluded over decades, appropriate. There were things that reason could illuminate, and things that it could only acknowledge. Boundary between these territories was the boundary at which Hercule Poirot stopped. He thought about the house itself, Ravenswood Manor, 4 stories of blackened limestone that had contained this particular story for 30 years before it produced a death. All houses, he thought, contained their stories in this way, in the weight of what was not said, in the care with which certain doors were locked and certain rooms avoided, the particular arrangements that families make with their own histories. The raven in the crest above the door, clutching its key. How appropriate in retrospect. What key? To what? The crest's inventor had probably meant something conventional, something heraldic and meaningless. And yet, he rose, eventually, and made himself a tisane, stood at the window of Whitehaven Mansions, looking at the London night with its 1,000 lit windows. Each one a room a life, each life containing the particular weight of what it had inherited from the lives that came before it. Sylvia Hargreaves had inherited poverty and grief, and the specific knowledge of an injustice committed and never answered. She had converted these 30 years into patience and precision, and ultimately into murder. The conversion was logical. It was also human, in the way that the worst human actions are always, beneath their wrongness, completely human, proceeding from recognizable feelings through recognizable processes to conclusions that the same feelings and processes could only have reached. He was not excusing her. He would never excuse murder, but he understood it, and understanding, with full clarity, without convenient simplification, was what the grey cells were for. He finished his tisane, rinsed the cup with the tidiness that was bone deep in him, and prepared himself for bed. Tomorrow there would be another letter, another case, another house with its secrets, another collection of human beings who had arrived at a collision point and needed Hercule Poirot to determine how they had arrived there. He did not find this prospect exhausting. He found it necessary. The world produced these moments with the regularity of gravity, and someone needed to stand in them with clear eyes and a willingness to see everything. He was, he acknowledged without false modesty, very good at this. It was his peculiar gift and his peculiar burden, and he had long ago made his peace with both. He turned out the lamp. The case of Ravenswood Manor was closed. Chapter 14, Raven Flies on It, is a quality of the cases that history records, those which are solved, properly solved, with every thread drawn in and every knot explained, that they do not feel, in the living of them, the way that they feel in retrospect. In retrospect, they have the neat inevitability of a well-constructed piece of music, each theme introduced and developed and resolved in its time, the ending apparent in the beginning to anyone who can hear the structure. In the living of them, they are cold corridors and unanswered questions, and the specific discomfort of standing in a house where someone has died and everyone is lying, and the truth is present in the room but will not yet show its face. Captain Hastings wrote up the case of Ravenswood Manor over the course of a fortnight, in the evenings in longhand, in the notebook he had begun at Poirot's kitchen table, with a cup of tea cooling beside him. He found, in the writing of it, that certain things became clear that had not been clear in the experiencings, the way the clues arranged themselves in retrospect into a pattern so legible that he felt, as he always felt, that he ought to have seen it sooner. He forgave himself this. Poirot had taught him to, on the grounds that retrospect is a fraudulent instrument, and that no one, not even Poirot, sees the pattern whole until the last piece is placed. He sent the manuscript, as he always sent these manuscripts, to a drawer in his desk, where it joined the others. Dorothea Voss did, as her letter had promised, make something worthwhile of Ravenswood Manor. Within 2 years of her father's death, she had opened the East Wing to a small architectural preservation society. The house, being of considerable historic merit, and had established, in the East Tower room, a modest study with the deed boxes properly catalogued and available to researchers interested in the social and economic history of the Midlands at the turn of the century. Portrait of Albert Hargreaves, hung in the East drawing room, properly attributed. She did not, she told Hastings in a Christmas letter some years later, feel that these actions constituted sufficient remedy for what had been done to the Hargreaves family. But she felt they were the actions that were available to her, and she believed in doing what was available, rather than lamenting what was not. Hastings told Poirot, who said, "She is, as I said, excellent woman." Sylvia Drummond served 7 years of her sentence before dying of a pneumonia that was brief, and those who visited her ported, not unwelcome. She was buried in the churchyard of the Derbyshire village nearest to Ravenswood Manor, at her own request, under her maiden name. Sylvia Hargreaves, 1884 to 1942, daughter of Albert Hargreaves. No other inscription, but those who looked closely saw that someone had placed, on the grave, a small carved raven in dark stone, wings spread, precise, watching. Poirot placed it there. Hastings never asked. Whether it was, in its wordless way, a verdict, or a memorial, or both. That was the question the grey cells could not answer, and which Poirot, characteristically, declined to address. Hastings always thought he knew. The end